83 years ago, First Lt Benjamin Kelsey of the United States Army Air Corps took off in an experimental Army aircraft from March Field in Riverside, California, on what would be a very exciting flight that marked the debut of one of the iconic aircraft of the Second World War. There was only ever one Lockheed XP-38, and yet it would change the face of aircraft design in the course of the war. The February 11th, 1939 flight of the XP-38 deserves to be remembered. United States fighter aircraft design lagged in the period between the wars, limited both by flawed strategic vision and limited funds. Aviation writer Michael O'Leary wrote in a 2005 edition of Air Classics magazine, "During the early 1930s, the United States Army Air Corps had a motley collection of combat aircraft. The fighters of the day were little more than glorified sport aircraft, built for a style of war that would never happen." Author Warren Bodie explained in his 1991 book, The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, It Goes Like Hell, that the U.S. Army Air Corps in the 1930s had a bomber mentality. Politicians in the military hierarchy looked upon pursuit airplanes as the tool for stirring up public interest in the Air Corps at air shows. After all, with the Navy offshore and the American continent so far from any possible aggressor, pursuit aircraft would never be a viable requirement. They were expensive toys. U.S. production of fighter aircraft lagged behind European rivals. Plane Talk, a newsletter of the War Eagles Air Museum of Santa Teresa, New Mexico, explains, in the mid-1930s, the Army and Navy fought bitterly over what little procurement money was available. There was virtually no interest in developing new technology. Most aircraft in service were obsolete. However, the newsletter notes, as international tensions increased in Europe and as Japan continued to build up forces in Asia, some U.S. military planners realized that the still isolationist nation was in a bad position. Two of the men who helped effect change were Lieutenants Benjamin Kelsey and Gordon Seville. Kelsey had earned an engineering degree from MIT and a commercial pilot's license before joining the Army Air Corps in 1929. In 1934, he was assigned to the Air Corps Materiel Command at Wright Field, near Dayton, as the fighter project officer in the engineering section, making him responsible for the Air Corps fighter aircraft development. Seville had served in the Army Reserve and the infantry before becoming a flying cadet in the Army Air Service in 1926. In 1934, he was an instructor at the Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field, Alabama, was on the Army board responsible for aircraft procurement. In 1937, Kelsey and Seville collaborated on the creation of two circular proposals, which are sets of performance goals that are sent to manufacturers for new interceptor fighters. Circular proposals X608 and 609. Bodie writes that the proposals were designed to avoid strict Air Corps limits on pursuit aircraft that were a result of Depression decade thinking, related and unrelated pressures, and numerous financial impingements. Notable among these, Kelsey complained, was that American fighters were geared to a peacetime concept. Armament was limited to about 500 pounds, arbitrarily consisting of one .30 caliber and one .50 caliber machine guns and the ammunition for them. Kelsey and Seville agreed that the Air Corps needed aircraft with far more horsepower and firepower, anticipating a need for 1,000 pounds of armament to overwhelm adversaries. Kelsey explained, there were simply no research and development funds available for development of the required aircraft, at least as a pursuit-type airplane. Seville and I were in total agreement that some special gimmick was needed if we were ever hope to launch our joint pet project. Bodie contends that their solution was not really innovative. Audacious, yes. Kelsey explained, we merely invented the interceptor category, at least in the American vernacular. This category had absolutely nothing to do with the European term pertaining to fast-climbing short-range bomber interceptors. Our nomenclature was aimed at getting 1,000 pounds of armament on board versus the standard 500 pounds. The proposals, 608 for a twin-engine aircraft and 609 for a single-engine aircraft, were radically more demanding than any previous U.S. Army Air Corps proposals, including a 360 mile-per-hour airspeed at 20,000 feet, 290 mile-per-hour airspeed at sea level, the ability to sustain full power for 1 hour at 20,000 feet, reach 20,000 feet in 6 minutes, and take off and land within 2,200 feet while clearing a 50-foot obstacle. The aircraft were to use one or two Allison V-12 liquid-cooled V-1710 engines using turbo superchargers to allow high-altitude performance. The V-1710 was, Bodie notes, the most powerful engine that was expected to be ready for production in 1938. The website Dave's Warburgs dryly notes, Many companies that were approached considered the specifications impossible. Circular Proposal 609 would eventually result in the Bell P-39 Air Cobra, but Circular Proposal 608 would lead to a much more radical design. At first glance, the Lockheed Company seems an unlikely source for a new high-tech, high-performance military aircraft. The company had been formed originally in 1912 by brothers Alan and Malcolm Lockheed, spelled Loughead, although the brothers later changed to the phonetic spelling Lockheed to avoid confusion. The original company had folded in 1920, the victim of the glut of cheap aircraft made available after the end of the Great War. They incorporated again in 1926. While the Lockheed Aircraft Company was moderately successful, the Great Depression devastated the aircraft market and the company went into receivership. A group of investors purchased the company for a mere $40,000 in 1932. The company found success with the Vega and the Model 10 Electra, which gained fame as the model that Amelia Earhart flew on her ill-fated attempt to fly around the world in 1937. Lockheed had nearly missed out to a Bell aircraft design in a previous contract for a heavy fighter and was invited to submit a proposal. But while the Lockheed Model 14 was the basis for the Hudson twin-engine bomber, Lockheed had never produced a combat-type military aircraft. The Aviation History Online Museum writes, Lockheed was new in the military aircraft market, and by competing against Boeing and Douglas, many felt that it was overstepping its boundaries. However, this view wasn't shared by Lockheed's president, Robert E. Gross, and he gave the go-ahead for his design team to proceed with a plan. Lockheed's 50-man design team was led by Chief Engineer Hal Hibbard and included designer Kelly Johnson, who had been instrumental in the design of the Model 10 Electra. The museum continues. Hibbard, Johnson, and their design team would come up with one of the boldest departures from traditional American fighter development. The website Today in Aviation says of the radical design, it was an unusual configuration, with a cockpit and armament in a center nacelle, with two longitudinal booms containing the engines and propellers, turbochargers, radiators, and coolers. The Lightning was equipped with tricycle landing gear. The nose strut retracted from the center nacelle, and the two main gear struts retracted into bays in the booms. Plain Talk explains that Hibbard and Johnson had considered 6 unorthodox airframe configurations, including a pusher prop model and an asymmetrical twin boom design with the cockpit in the left boom, before settling on the classic P-38 layout. The plane was sleek, was the first U.S. fighter design to have all its control surfaces covered in aluminum rather than fabric. The twin boom design offered the pilot a good vantage point, and mounting the armament in the nose was logical, but also offered a special advantage. The Warbird Resource Group explains, clustering all the armament in the nose was unlike most other U.S. aircraft, which used wing-mounted guns with trajectories set to crisscross at one or more points in a convergence zone. Guns mounted in the nose did not suffer from having their useful ranges limited by pattern convergence, meaning good pilots could shoot much further. A Lightning could reliably hit targets at any range up to 1,000 yards, whereas other fighters had to pick a single convergence range between 100 and 250 yards. The Aviation History Online Museum explains it had twice the power and was almost twice the size of its predecessors. It had 4 50-caliber machine guns plus a 20mm cannon, enough firepower to sink a ship, which it sometimes did. In fact, the number of radical design elements might typically have doomed the aircraft in an era when the Army was avoiding radical concepts. The museum argues, in this respect, it was very unusual that the Lightning design progressed beyond the testing stage. Such radical concepts seldom achieved production status. But the simple fact was that the P-38 was needed more than ever. While competitors consolidated, Curtiss, Douglas, and Vultee submitted proposals, Kelsey was impressed with the Lockheed design. Plain Talks writes, on June 23, 1937, the Air Corps awarded contract number AC-9974 for $163,000 to Lockheed for one twin-engine XP-38 interceptor. Lockheed called it the Model 22. It was the 22nd aircraft design to emerge from the fledgling 11-year-old company, and it was Lockheed's first military contract. But a prototype is only that. As O'Leary notes, the company team was pleased with this, although they realized that the new plane was radical, and one aircraft might not lead to production if the design didn't perform as required. Design and construction of the prototype took just over a year and a half, and despite the $162,000 contract, cost the company more than $600,000. Plain Talk writes, the sleek, all-silver prototype rolled out of the factory, shrouded in canvas and in great secrecy, on December 31st, 1938. It was trucked to March Field, near Riverside, California, to start flight testing. The XP-38 was 37 feet 10 inches long, had a wingspan of 52 feet and an overall height of 12 feet 10 inches. The testing would be done by Ben Kelsey. The first flight was January 27, 1939, and, as is common for a first test flight, revealed stability issues that had to be addressed. The problems were addressed, and Kelsey flew 5 more times over the next 2 weeks. Then, a fateful choice. The Aviation Online History Museum notes, the Army decided to lift the wraps of secrecy and schedule the sole prototype for a transcontinental speed dash on February 11, 1939, from Marchfield, California, to Mitchell Field, New York. It was a critical decision that would haunt them for years. There was a particular motivation behind the choice. Plain Talk writes, General Henry H. Hap Arnold, with a strong desire to get the Army Air Corps into the news in a positive manner, ordered Kelsey and the XP-38 to try for a new cross-country speed record. A planned transfer of the aircraft to Wright Field near Dayton, Ohio for official Army testing grew into a transcontinental dash from Marchfield to Mitchell Field on Long Island, New York. And the XP-38 did not disappoint. The website Today in Aviation writes, Lieutenant Kelsey departed Marchfield at 6:32 a.m. Pacific Standard Time and flew to Amarillo, Texas, for the first of 2 refueling stops. He arrived there at 12:22 p.m. Eastern Standard Time and remained on the ground for 22 minutes. The XP-38 took off at 12:44 Eastern Standard Time, and Kelsey flew onto Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio. He landed there at 3:10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The prototype averaged 340 miles per hour. It reached 420 miles per hour during the Wright Field to Mitchell Field segment. Excluding the time for the 2 refueling stops, the XP-38 had broken the transcontinental speed record set by Howard Hughes in his H-1 Racer in 1939. But there was one wrinkle, as the Sunday Times of Zanesville, Ohio wrote on February 12th. A new secret twin-engine Army pursuit monoplane crashed into a tree on the edge of Mitchell Field, Long Island. As Kelsey approached Mitchell Field, he was placed in a pattern behind some slower training aircraft. He throttled back, and as he attempted to throttle back up to land, the carburetor had iced over, and he could not increase power. He crashed into a golf course. Kelsey was not seriously injured, but the prototype was destroyed. The Online Museum of Aviation History laments, the XP-38 crashed after only 16 days, with an airtime of 11 hours and 50 minutes. While some of the Lockheed engineers argued that the loss of the prototype delayed production by more than a year, Bodie recounts Kelsey making the exact opposite argument. The crash allowed Hap Arnold to sell the necessary officials and politicians on the plane on its record performance, without having to justify it with hard data. Kelsey estimated the crash actually saved Lockheed about a year on getting the next series out. However, aviation historian Martin Caden argues that the loss of the prototype meant that technical problems that would have been identified in testing were not discovered until the aircraft saw combat, resulting in the loss of many pilots' lives. Bodie notes that it was the only American fighter aircraft in production throughout the American involvement in the war. More than 10,000 were produced. So many were ordered that Lockheed was swamped. As the Online Museum of Aviation History explains, it was basically a hand-built airplane. It was never meant to be mass-produced. All skin sections were butt-joined using flush riveting, and all flight controls were metal-covered. The total order was expected to be only 50 aircraft, so when orders started coming in by the hundreds, Lockheed had to scramble to find room to increase production. Over lunch, Lockheed's president, Bob Gross, made a deal to buy the old 3G whiskey distillery for $20,000 to make room for an additional production line. Despite being produced in a whiskey distillery, the P-38 would rack up an impressive war record. P-38s would fly more than 130,000 missions and shoot down more Japanese fighters than any other aircraft. Also well suited for reconnaissance, some 90% of Allied area film captured over Europe during the war was taken by a P-38. It was used by some of America's most prolific aces, including Dick Bong, America's top flying ace of the war, and because of its impressive flying range when fitted with additional fuel tanks. P-38s were used in the April 1943 Operation Vengeance, the mission to assassinate Japanese Admiral Isakuro Yamamoto, a turning point in the war. And it all started by crashing into a golf course. Bodie quoted Kelsey, who eventually became a brigadier general. While most historians have never even been curious about how a washed-out aircraft with less than 12 hours total flight time could justify immediate go-ahead for production, has always been a source of amazement to me. And yet in the end he loved the aircraft. That comfortable cluck, he said, would fly like hell, fight like a wasp upstairs, and land like a butterfly. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.